In early March 1941, a cold wind swept across the coast of northern France. The wreckage of a British Bristol Blenheim bomber lay scattered across a muddy field near Calais. German soldiers from the 3rd Flak Regiment were combing through what remained: twisted metal, burnt rubber, shattered glass. But amid the debris, one officer found something that made him stop. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a radio. It was a small, oddly shaped box, sealed tight with bolts, filled with wires and valves. The stenciled label on the side read, Type 279, Airborne Interception Unit. He didn't know it yet, but what he was holding would expose a technological secret that had changed the entire course of the air war: British radar. When the box arrived in Berlin days later, Luftwaffe scientists at Rechlin Air Base were immediately intrigued. It looked like a radio transmitter, but the frequencies it used were far beyond anything Germany had ever built. One of the engineers, Dr. Erich Hütten, later wrote in his notes, "It behaved not as a receiver, but as an eye. It was not meant to hear, but to see." That eye was radar, short for radio detection and ranging, and Britain had used it to defend its skies during the Battle of Britain just months earlier. While German pilots believed their bombing campaigns had nearly broken the Royal Air Force, in truth, the RAF had something invisible protecting them: a network of early warning radar stations known as the Chain Home System. Each of these towers, scattered across the British coastline, sent out radio pulses that could detect incoming aircraft more than 100 miles away. It allowed the RAF to scramble fighters with uncanny precision, intercepting German bombers before they reached their targets. Germany's air fleet commanders, men like Hermann Göring, couldn't understand how Britain always seemed to know where they'd strike. They suspected spies, luck, anything but science. Now, in 1941, they finally had proof. The captured device was carefully dismantled under the supervision of Dr. Rudolf Kuhnhold, head of the Naval Research Laboratory, and Dr. Hans Hollmann, a brilliant microwave specialist. What they found inside stunned them. The key component was a small copper block, round, sealed, and surprisingly heavy for its size. Inside it was a magnetron, an invention the Germans had never seen before. This single device, no larger than a clenched fist, could generate powerful radio waves in the 10-centimeter wavelength, what scientists called the microwave band. Germany's radar systems, like the Freya and Würzburg, operated on much longer wavelengths, 50 to 60 centimeters. Those systems were bulky, required massive antennas, and couldn't pinpoint targets precisely. The British, on the other hand, were seeing their enemies in near photographic detail. Dr. Kuhnhold immediately recognized the implications. If this technology was understood and replicated, Germany could build radar systems capable of guiding night fighters with pinpoint accuracy, detecting enemy ships beyond the horizon, and even spotting low-flying bombers before they struck. But there was a problem. Germany didn't know how to build it. The magnetron required manufacturing precision that German industry, stretched thin by wartime shortages, simply couldn't replicate. It demanded copper of exact purity, vacuum chambers that could seal to a tolerance of 1/10,000,000th of an atmosphere, and ceramic insulators Germany didn't yet produce at scale. By contrast, across the Atlantic, the United States had just begun mass-producing magnetrons at MIT's Radiation Laboratory under the Tizard mission, a scientific alliance formed in 1940 between Britain and America. Within months, the U.S. would turn the magnetron from a laboratory curiosity to a factory product, building over 150,000 radar units by the end of 1944. Germany, meanwhile, built fewer than 1,200 high-frequency radar systems in the same period. It wasn't that German scientists weren't capable, it was that their leadership didn't see radar as decisive. Göring famously dismissed radar as a scientist's toy, insisting that the human eye and German instinct were enough. It was a decision that would haunt them. By late 1941, British radar-equipped night fighters, Bristol Beaufighters fitted with AI Mark IV radar, were hunting German bombers in the darkness over London. The Luftwaffe had entered the age of invisible warfare without realizing it. The British weren't just using radar for defense, they were refining it for offense, fitting it onto ships, aircraft, and even bombs. Operation Biting, the famous Brunel raid in February 1942, saw British paratroopers capture key components of the German Würzburg radar and bring them back to England. The Allies now knew exactly what Germany was working with and how far behind they were. Inside Germany, efforts were made to understand the captured British system. The device was reverse-engineered, tested, and even reconstructed under the project code Berlin Reise, Berlin Giant, but production never reached operational levels. The prototypes failed under stress, overheated, or burned out after a few hours. The Luftwaffe's radar operators, frustrated, reverted to long-wave systems. We knew the British could see us, but we didn't understand how they could see through us, wrote one German technician. In 1942, the Allies introduced a new radar variant, the H-2S ground mapping radar, capable of identifying terrain features from 30,000 feet. When a damaged Lancaster bomber carrying one crashed near Rotterdam in February 1943, the Germans recovered the intact radar. Once again, they had the enemy's secret in their hands. Once again, they didn't understand what they were looking at. They named it Rotterdam Gerät, the Rotterdam device, and sent it to the Telefunken laboratories in Berlin. Technicians there identified the same mysterious heart, a cavity magnetron. The English are building miracles, we build theories, one scientist remarked. In July 1943, Telefunken engineers attempted to replicate the British magnetron design. The tests worked in bursts, producing clear blips on screens, aircraft, clouds, even vehicles moving on the ground. But the components couldn't handle sustained power. Within weeks, the German prototypes melted, cracked, and failed. Meanwhile, the Allies were expanding their radar capabilities exponentially. The U.S. Navy's CXM radar could detect planes 100 miles away. The H-2X radar could map cities like Berlin even through thick cloud cover. American bombers carried radar bomb sights that guided them to their targets with terrifying accuracy. By late 1943, the radar advantage had turned into strategic domination. The Allies knew when and where German convoys moved, when U-boats surfaced, and when Luftwaffe aircraft took off. Radar wasn't just helping them fight, it was rewriting the way wars were fought. Inside Germany, frustration turned to disbelief. In a confidential report dated October 1943, a Luftwaffe officer wrote, "The enemy seems to possess eyes that pierce night and cloud. Our defenses are blind without the moon." That blindness only grew worse as the Allies began deploying radar deception, jamming and spoofing German signals with techniques like window, in which Allied bombers dropped millions of aluminum strips to create false radar echoes. Entire squadrons disappeared from German screens. Defensive coordination collapsed. And all the while, Germany's radar scientists, once the pride of Europe, could only watch the chaos unfold, unable to stop it. By the end of 1944, the truth was undeniable. Germany had captured radar, they had studied it, tested it, and even copied it. But they had never truly understood it. Not because of ignorance, but because of arrogance. They believed the war could still be won with courage, discipline, and experience. But radar belonged to a new age, one ruled not by instinct, but by information.
By the beginning of 1944, the night skies over Germany had become a battlefield of light and shadow. Invisible waves bouncing across the heavens, unseen signals deciding who lived and who died. Radar had transformed from a scientific curiosity into a weapon as decisive as the tank or the bomb. And yet, inside the Luftwaffe command, few truly understood how far behind they had fallen. Every night, Allied bombers roared across the Rhine in tight formation. Hundreds of aircraft guided by airborne radar, navigating through clouds, darkness, and heavy flak with unshakable precision. German night fighters, once the terror of the skies, were now blind hunters. Their primitive Lichtenstein radar, operating on long wavelengths around 61 centimeters, couldn't distinguish a bomber from the jamming noise flooding their receivers. The British called their countermeasure window. First used during Operation Gomorrah, the bombing of Hamburg in July 1943, window was brutally simple. Allied bombers dropped millions of aluminum foil strips, each cut to half the wavelength of German radar signals. The strips reflected radio waves, filling German radar screens with ghost signals, thousands of phantom aircraft. The night of July 24, 1943, would become known as the firestorm of Hamburg. Over 700 Royal Air Force bombers swept across the city. German operators at radar stations from Bremen to Kiel watched their scopes erupt in chaos, the screens solid white with echoes. They called their headquarters in panic, believing an invasion fleet was coming. When they realized it was deception, it was already too late. The radar net had collapsed. That single operation marked the beginning of the end for German radar defense. General Josef Kammhuber, head of the night fighter system, had once built the Kammhuber Line, a sophisticated belt of radar, searchlights, and fighter zones stretching from Denmark to France. It was designed to guide night fighters directly to their targets. It had worked for a time during 1941 and early 1942, when radar meant advantage. But by 1943, it had become a trap. Every frequency, every code, every defensive rhythm was known to the Allies. Captured German documents later revealed that by autumn 1943, radar jamming effectiveness had reached 95%. Entire sectors of the Kammhuber Line were rendered useless. The network, which had once been the pride of German innovation, became obsolete in less than a year. Inside the Telefunken laboratories in Berlin, engineers were desperate. They tried shifting frequencies, boosting power, and redesigning the Lichtenstein SN2 radar to operate on longer wavelengths immune to window interference. But by the time it reached frontline aircraft in spring 1944, the Allies had already adapted again. Their Monica tail-warning radars were being tracked by German night fighters until the British learned to shut them off. The skies had become a deadly chess game of electronic warfare. Move and countermove, signal and silence. But Germany was always one step behind. In February 1944, a top-secret Luftwaffe intelligence briefing concluded. Enemy radar and countermeasures are evolving faster than our capacity to comprehend them. We are fighting ghosts with lanterns. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America's radar production was scaling beyond imagination. The MIT Radiation Laboratory employed more than 4,000 scientists and engineers, working day and night on radar innovations. The U.S. was spending $2.7 billion on radar research, more than it had spent on the entire Manhattan Project at that time. In contrast, Germany's total radar research budget in 1944 barely exceeded 100 million Reichsmarks. The gap wasn't just technological, it was philosophical. The Allies treated radar as a weapon of strategy. Germany treated it as an accessory, a support tool. And in modern warfare, that distinction was fatal. In June 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, radar played a silent but decisive role. The Germans had been deceived by a phantom invasion, Operation Fortitude, supported by radar decoys and false transmissions that made it appear as if a massive fleet was heading towards Calais. The real invasion hit Normandy. Luftwaffe General Alfred Jodl would later say, "We did not lose the war because we lacked courage. We lost because we fought an invisible enemy with visible weapons."
By late 1944, the collapse of German air defense was total. Allied H-2X radar, a U.S. version of the British H-2S system, allowed bombers to identify targets like oil refineries and railway yards even through heavy cloud cover. German radar-guided flak units, still relying on Würzburg D sets, couldn't distinguish decoys from real bombers. Ammunition was wasted, coordination broke down, and morale plummeted. At Peenemünde, scientists who had built the V-2 rocket program watched in disbelief as Allied radar-guided bombers destroyed their launch sites one by one, using the very technology Germany had once captured and underestimated. By January 1945, the war was collapsing in on itself. Allied air supremacy was absolute. The Luftwaffe was losing 400 aircraft a week, many without even sighting their attackers. German radar installations were being systematically targeted using radar homing missiles like the Allied Shrike prototype, technology that Germany had believed impossible. In a cold, dimly lit bunker beneath Berlin, Dr. Hans Holman sat beside the remains of the captured British magnetron he had studied 4 years earlier. He was one of the last radar physicists still working in the city. The Allied bombings had destroyed most research facilities. In his diary, he wrote, "We once thought knowledge was our strength, but pride made us blind. We captured the future and called it impossible." When Germany finally surrendered, in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams under Operation Alsos and Project Lusty swept through laboratories across Europe, seizing every radar-related document they could find. What they discovered stunned them. The Germans had excellent radar engineers, brilliant physicists, and working prototypes of advanced systems, but all of it had been too late. Among the items recovered was a report dated March 1944, signed by General Wolfgang Martini, Chief of Luftwaffe Signals. Captured British devices indicate radar potential beyond our current comprehension. Unless leadership grants priority equal to jet propulsion, our defeat in the air is certain. His warning had been ignored. After the war, many of those same German scientists were recruited by the Allies. Dr. Kuhnhold and several of his colleagues later contributed to radar and microwave technology in civilian applications, ship navigation, air traffic control, and even weather forecasting. Their work would lay the foundation for the post-war technological boom. Ironically, the same minds that had once been denied resources by the Nazi regime helped build the modern world's radar infrastructure under Allied guidance. But the most haunting moment came in 1946, during a private debriefing between British and German scientists at Farnborough, England. One of the former German engineers asked to see the latest Allied radar equipment. When the British officer opened the panel to reveal the new cavity magnetron, smaller, lighter, and 10 times more powerful, the German scientist reportedly whispered, "We had it before the war. We just never believed it mattered." That was the essence of Germany's technological downfall. Not ignorance, but disbelief. In the end, the radar Germany captured was more than a machine. It was a mirror. It reflected the difference between two ways of fighting a war, one driven by ideology and pride, the other by science and adaptation. And when the war ended and the smoke cleared from the cities of Europe, radar remained, invisible, silent, and watching. The symbol of a truth every soldier learned too late. You can't fight what you refuse to understand.